Gerard, welcome back for, I guess this is technically your third appearance on the Turned Out a Punk.
Hey, be quiet. Be quiet. Sorry, Damien. I've got a barky hound over here. He wanted to say hi to his legion of fans across the world.
Exactly. Well, we like cameos on this show, so that's awesome. What's your dog's name?
His name is Jake.
Oh, Jake. Hello, Jake. Welcome to the show. And I guess, like, as I said, Gerard, I was just telling you, this is like your second appearance on this show, but your third appearance on Turn Out a Punk as a whole, being on Clobbering Time as well.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think you need to cast a wider web for guests, to tell you the truth. So, well, I think by the time I've been on 4 times, I suspect people will have had their fill.
Well, you're drinking from the rarefied air that only you and MVP are able to drink from.
Yeah, that's true. I'm in good company.
Exactly. Like there are very few twice appearancers, let alone the thrice appearancers. It's a rare club with just the two of you. So, welcome back. And
thank you. Thanks for having me.
Well, and as I was saying, I kind of want to continue on right from where we left off, because when we left off, you had just moved to New York and you were living one room away from then Rob Zombie. And I think that's where we left it off last time.
Yeah, I don't remember exactly, but yeah, there was a period. I'm going to guess this is probably around 85 or so, 85, early 86, that I'm living in a basement on East 13th Street in New York. Rob and Sean from White Zombie were the prior tenants in this not entirely legal basement apartment. For a while, Victor Poison Tet from Rat Out Rat R was living in the basement with us. George Cartwright, the sax player, was living upstairs. Joe Coleman, the performance artist, was living 2 doors away on the same street.
You're bearing the lead on that one, Gerard. He's also the lead singer of the Steel Tips.
Yes, of course. Richard Kern lived a couple of blocks away on Avenue B, so it was kind of sort of your New York super scum neighborhood at that time.
Well, I guess was everyone hanging out with each other at that point too? Because it seems like, for my tastes, getting into this stuff, all of you existed in one world. So were you all existing in one world?
I mean, yes and no. I mean, there definitely were like cliques and sub-cliques, but there definitely, for a time, there were sort of gangs of people who spent a lot of time together socially. I mean, when Pussy Galore moved to New York, they were not entirely embraced by a lot of the older bands and whatever, but I mean, White Zombie were certainly friends with them, and that was kind of an ongoing thing. It's not like there were dinner parties or whatnot, but certainly people did hang out a bit. But yeah, there was kind of like an invisible like line in the sand between like the prior generation of Sonic Youth, Swans, Live Skull, Rat Out Rat R, and the younger bands, as typified by a Pussy Galore, who were newer arrivals in New York. But then again, lots of people in New York didn't grow up in New York, myself included. Yeah, I mean, there was. I mean, yeah, I think. I mean, you could probably make a case that it was, one big happy family. Except, like lots of families, they're divided by generation.
Were there any bands that kind of united everyone? Like, were there? I guess were like people weren't really going to see the Ramones in the same way at that point, obviously. But like, were there any bands that kind of like bridged all the world? Would you say at that point?
Not really. I mean, I think it was pretty fragmented. I mean, probably the closest would have been Sonic Youth, in that they were very adept, and they did this a lot when they would play in New York. They would really, really go out of their way to try to make for a more kind of comprehensive, interesting bill. And they would very often ask people to play with them who were both peers, but in other cases, maybe younger bands who kind of looked up to them, or bands that up until that point hadn't received any kind of a real break in terms of visibility. So, it wouldn't be unusual for them to play with somebody who had been, peers and buddies for a decade or so, but also a couple of younger bands that were a lot newer on the scene. So there was always like a lot of like weird jockeying for position. I remember people, complaining about paydays after a show at the Cat Club once and sort of thinking, well, who did everybody pay to see? and like, boo hoo, you only got $300. That's $250 more than you would have made if you had played on your own. But stuff like that, even today you hear stories like that. So it's
absolutely. So where were the when you first moved down there, what were some of the bands that you were kind of going? I guess it was was this all stuff that you were signing at that time, or were there other bands you were kind of checking out? Like it's 84 in New York. Like were you going to go and see any of the hardcore stuff that was happening, or were you kind of over it by that point?
Yeah, no, I was. I mean, there were a few things I would go see, and frankly, I was not. That was not a scene I was part of in New York, and those were not people who were buddies of mine. I went to some records a bunch of times, and Dwayne was certainly a really nice guy, and turned me on to a lot of great records. But that was definitely not part of my thing. I did get to see the Cro-Mags and Agnostic Front and Warzone and Urban Waste and a lot of bands of that period. But, simply put, I was not really a fan of those bands. Mm-hmm. And that definitely was not my crowd, for lack of a better word. Anytime I went to like the CD's matinees, I was absolutely the dude way in the back. like you have the doorway, and I'm standing 30 feet beyond the doorway just to make sure I don't get my glasses smashed into 80,000 pieces. But yeah, I went to a lot of shows, not so much because I was scouting or looking for people to sign. That didn't really have a ton to do with it. It was more because I was interested in who was playing, and I wanted to learn more, and just as a fan of music primarily. And it's not super different from how I go to see shows now.
Yeah, because we mentioned this on the last show, or I mentioned it, I should say, on the last show, that you are the fan's fan when it comes to music, but sports as well, and wrestling. No, I mean, and you don't have to. I don't expect you to follow this up or say anything, but like I really do think that you're like someone who goes to see bands, not because, and this is such a rarity in the music industry, not because you're scouting them, but because you like music.
Yeah, I mean, there's other people who do that too. I'm certainly not the only one.
No, you're not the only one, but there's certainly shows that I've been to where you were the only one, Gerard, not to cut you off.
Okay, well, yes. There actually have literally been shows where I was the only person at the show.
Exactly.
That's kind of grim. I don't take any pride in that. It's especially bad if you're the only person at the show and you're the promoter. That's a bad... Yeah. That's probably a very bad sign.
It's worse than when you're in the band, though.
Yeah, that's pretty bad too. I've been on that end of it as well. So, look, it would be nice if I developed other interests after all this time. I should probably get into something else. Gardening is pretty happening, I'm told. The food blogging scene, I may have crested already, but I guess there's always room for one more. But yeah, my interests are rather limited, so I plead guilty to that.
I was going to say, so with Homestead at that point, I guess you moved to New York. Does it feel like you're now in the music industry at all, or are you still kind of like doing your own thing, just working at this label?
It's hard to say because, I think from the outside, it probably looks like, oh, yeah, it's the music industry because Dutch East India Trading is a distributor and Homestead is a quote-unquote record label. But, we're way the fuck out there on Long Island. We're in a pretty dead suburban neighborhood. We're not making any money. It's the music industry technically, but it's really the super butt end of the music industry. and the way that the next generation of indie labels would sort of be seen as sort of like the harbingers of what would happen next culturally and critically. The way that major labels would sort of vulturize, cherry pick them, whatever. That wasn't happening with labels like Homestead in the mid 1980s. We were maybe not as subterranean as a legit DIY label, but we neither had the credibility of a DIY label or the resources to compete commercially. So it was kind of the worst of all possible worlds. So, yeah. Yes, it is, strictly speaking, the music industry, but such a shitty third-rate version of it that you wouldn't be compelled to sort of pat yourself on the back and be like, "Oh, cool, we're in the biz." that really wasn't happening.
That must have been a hell of a commute too, every day.
Yeah, it was. I mean, I had a number of different means of getting to work every day. Sometimes it would be driving, other times it would be the subway to the Long Island Railroad, then walking. Yeah, I don't have many fond memories of that particular journey. So,
did your taste change at all when you moved to New York, or was it already something that was kind of naturally happening when you were in Boston?
No, I think my tastes were always probably growing a little bit over time. I mean, there was definitely things that I probably had little interest in that over time I got more interested in just by being exposed to different bands and different records, and also living in neighborhoods with different types of people. So, however narrow my sort of focus on punk, whatever was thought of as indie rock, underground rock, whatever, whether I liked it or not, I was definitely getting exposed to a lot of other things in terms of music from other parts of the world, music that rhythmically had a little bit more going on, music that was not entirely song-based. Whatever kind of flirtations I had with that stuff when I was a kid, being in New York meant that I was kind of being barraged with it on a much more frequent basis, and that was exciting. That was definitely an exciting thing. I mean, New York was certainly a good place to be for that, and probably did a lot to sort of kick me in the ass and make me think more about, the whole notion of music begins and ends here. In fact, that's not really the case. Music actually begins somewhere a lot further back, and the end point is actually nowhere in sight, which is a good thing.
Mm-hmm. It's kind of funny because, like, the scene, I guess you're kind of like I don't know the scene, but like the stuff that was happening at that point is like a genre that doesn't really have a name as far as I know, but it gets brought up on the show a lot. Like when Bricks from The Fall was on, she brought it up, and there was like this kind of group of bands that sonically don't necessarily sound the same, but they all for some reason exist in the same orbit. And it's like, Pussy Galore, Sonic Youth, like the Swans, the Bad Seed, or the Birthday Party. It just feels like, did it feel like a scene, or is that something after the fact that,
Yeah, no, it absolutely did, but like really kind of in a vague sense. Like you didn't ever actually feel like those bands were like living in a house together, Monkeys style, or that, they were necessarily best buddies or whatever. But it's like a wider creative community, and you would sort of presume that, like, just like for instance, if Crime in the City Solution were playing New York, that you would see a lot of other musicians who were sort of that era. You would see them at the show, not because they were expected to be there, not because it was like, hey, we're the welcoming party or whatever, but that's kind of what you did. You were involved and you were curious. You were either a fan of these people because of the bands they'd been in before, or it's just what you did. And there wasn't a name for it. There absolutely wasn't a name for it. I mean, indie rock as a so-called institution or whatever, that hadn't really come to be at that point. I mean, the phrase existed, but I don't think it was really until the Sebadoh song that people began throwing it around left and right, and almost instantly it became a joke. Almost instantly, it was sort of a pejorative rather than an actual subgenre or something you would claim to be. I mean, by the time bands were actually referring to themselves as indie rock, that was probably a pretty good sign they were lame.
Yeah,
it was sort of like declaring yourself a new wave band in 1979. It was sort of like an admission that you were sort of like a third or fourth generation thing that didn't have particularly broad or fully formed aesthetic. I mean, punk as a term, I guess a lot of people thought it was played out, so you didn't hear that being used very often. And certainly that encompasses so many things. Mm-hmm. Maybe it wasn't descriptive enough. I think I could be wrong, but I feel like it was that Christgau was the first person to start using the phrase "pig fuck."
Okay, yeah.
And which I at the time didn't find very appealing, no. and considered it to be kind of a dismissive, a somewhat dismissive thing, and a way of lumping a lot of people together who were actually very unique. So the extent to which that actually became sort of a bin card at the record store or a way for other journalists to classify bands. I mean, I understand how that stuff happens, but again, I don't know a single band from that period that called themselves Pigfuck or appreciated it in any fashion.
It didn't really stick around either. You don't really hear people looking back to the great days of the Pigfuck scene.
Yeah, so it's just one of those things where, I mean, especially if you're a journalist, you want to be able to put things in some sort of a context, and the fastest way to do that is if you've got a category or a catchphrase, and that hasn't changed. That still exists today. The problem is sometimes the categories and the catchphrases have absolutely nothing to do with what the band's motives were, what their inspirations are, what they hope to achieve. So you have to learn to look beyond that stuff.
So where were you kind of finding out about bands at this point? Still from fanzines and I guess college radio. Is there was definitely college radio in New York, obviously.
Yeah, I mean college radio was still, very, very important. And I don't feel like college radio in New York at that point in time was nearly as good as what was happening in Boston during the same period. Mm-hmm. But, WNYU had the New Afternoon Show, which still exists to this day. Tim Somer had his show on WNYU during the early to mid-1980s. WFMU was obviously, an incredibly great radio station at that point in time. You had WSIA in Staten Island, WFDU at Fairleigh Dickinson, WPRB in Princeton. So there was, the region did have really good radio, but zines had a lot to do with it too. I mean, that was, that era when Forced Exposure Mark II, when Byron joined up with Jimmy, that was really great. The Offense newsletter out of Columbus, Ohio, was very strong. I'm sure there's folks I'm forgetting, but Ugly American out of New Jersey was. We were talking before about people who were kind of mean and vicious. That was certainly a super mean and vicious zine, but very, very well written and very, very, very strong musical taste. Away from the Pulse Beat, which only lasted a few issues, but I wish I still had every copy of it. That was a really good one. Flesh and Bones out of New Jersey, Suburban Relapse out of Florida. It was really a golden age for great American zines.
Well, it was just like the golden age for American underground culture. I guess this is like just before it bursts and becomes like, today mainstream culture, but like before it sort of starts percolating over to more mainstream. This is like the golden era, right?
I guess. I mean, when you call it the golden era, it's not as though, again, nobody was really making any money off of it.
No, it's not. Well, that doesn't come till later. We all know the golden era is not where you pay, right? This is the golden era of this podcast, and believe me, I'm not making a cent.
Yeah, but in terms of a lot of great stuff happened, and again, it wasn't purely limited to punk and hardcore, and there's like this super sort of codified underground thing. I mean, Kicks as a zine had existed years earlier, and that was really great. On like a slightly more, I don't want to say mainstream, but probably a little more on the pop singer-songwriter end of things was Matter out of Chicago, which was very good. It certainly introduced a lot of great writers to the popular mindset of the day. A lot of Albini's best writing was in Matter at that time. So yeah, it was really kind of blossoming. And yeah, I mean, you would go to a record store and there would be 6 or 7 things to choose from to read, and that was you don't really have that today.
Yeah, no, it's true, and it's also, I guess, for a while it felt like a lot of it was happening online, but it just seems like that the writing about this type of music has dried up a lot online.
Yeah,
in the same, well, maybe, but that's a bummer conversation. Let's move on to much more happier things. I guess like around this time is like, and now everyone's back together and friends again. This is when you and Dinosaur Jr. kind of have the parting of ways, right?
Yeah, I'm gonna guess that was probably around. Boy, my memory's really bad, but probably around '86 or so.
Sorry, go on.
Yeah, and that I mean, they'd done one album on Homestead, which initially was met with almost total radio silence. But slowly over time, people began to get into it, and they certainly turned a lot of heads as a live band. I think the real breakthrough for them was around the time that Sonic Youth sort of took them under their wing and started giving them shows in New York. That really changed the whole nature of Dinosaur's relationship to the audience. It suddenly went from them playing these very tiny shows in front of angry sound men pulling the plug to much more sort of sympathetic audiences, like who really got what they were doing. And yeah, I mean, I was certainly very hurt at the time that they left Homestead, but in retrospect, it was a pretty obvious move on their part. I mean, they kind of had to do it. On one hand, they were being asked to record for the label that everybody wanted to be on, and I'm referring to SST, of course. Mm-hmm. I mean, SST at that point could not have been a hotter label in terms of, where it was in everyone's consciousness. I mean, it kind of dwarfed everything and everybody in American underground music, Homestead included. I mean, Homestead was so many strides behind. It's like SST is Secretariat, and Homestead is the horse that's running in third or fourth. Or fifth maybe. So, I mean, just in terms of actually having any distribution and having the ability to sort of elevate a band beyond this like very tiny little subculture, SST was obviously a much better label to be on, and a lot of the stuff involving SST and their the legal issues, the financial issues, the accounting issues. None of that was really apparent at the time. None of that had really come to the fore yet. It wouldn't be for several years before that stuff began being talked about, whereas Homestead was having problems like almost immediately, like in terms of like ability to pay bills on time and pay royalties on time and deliver accounting statements anyone could make heads or tails of. So the idea that a band would want to leave Homestead to be on SST, that's a no-brainer. Mm-hmm. That's like I mean, I can't even begin to imagine why somebody would have turned that down. I was kind of bent out of shape with the way that particular thing happened, but again, it's like conflict resolution is not everyone's style, and I've never been in a position as a recording artist where someone said, "Hey, why don't you leave your friend's sucky label for a label that's good?" So, I mean, I don't know how I would have handled it. I don't know. I can't tell you that I would have handled it with any more grace and forthrightness than Jay did. So, it's I consider that all water under the bridge. That shit happened a long time ago, and they went on to make some amazing records, obviously, and continue to make amazing records. And I'm very, very happy I played whatever part, however small, in getting their thing off the ground.
Well, yeah, and like I obviously like I think it's everything's in the past. I've got that post on my Instagram, the photo of you guys all hanging out together recently, so I know it's all in the past now. But I think the other thing I wanted to really kind of touch on was SST really the only threat as far as taking bands away? Because it's not like major labels were really signing these artists at that time.
No, I mean, there every now and then there'd be like some comedy of like getting a generic letter in the mail from a major label, like asking for free records, or there'd be some like weird third-hand story about, like the A&R guy who is trying to be cool at the moment goes to a show. But yeah, there was never any serious talk about major labels swooping after those bands. I mean, by the time Big Dipper left Homestead for Epic, I think that was the only example of a major label poaching a Homestead band, and it was sort of like it was hard to tell what was the worst decision on that part. On one hand, those guys were completely justified in wanting to get off Homestead. On the other hand, it didn't take a genius to know that they were going to be one and done on Epic. I mean, it was like at that point, the whole cliche of major label signs band they have no idea what to do with was so firmly established and was happening so often. Just again, still pre-Nirvana, so you couldn't even say, well, at least so and so is doing well. I mean, there was nobody doing well. So. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean that didn't really happen. I mean, certainly, Big Black went to Touch and Go, and that I wouldn't characterize that as anything other than a super smart move on the part of both Corey and Steve. But they had a pre-existing relationship. Touch and Go was a great label musically. It was a great label in a business sense. They certainly ran a very ethical operation. So, I mean, there was no surprise there. If Homestead had done a better job for Big Black, maybe they would have stayed, but probably not. Mm-hmm. That doesn't say the label shouldn't have done a better job for them. There were a number of other like distributor-run labels at the time. I mean, Gem had PVC. Relativity. Important had Relativity and Combat. Caroline had their in-house label. There was Enigma out on the West Coast that had any number of labels. So there's probably more talk about those companies having an interest. Mm-hmm. But again, it didn't really happen that much. It didn't really come to play that often.
Well, yeah, I guess it's like until Nirvana, that's when everything really, I guess, ultimately changes for everything, right? Yeah. With SST, it's kind of it's so weird to think that label at one point had like was the big label, and like had everyone, like every big artist signed to them, and then it's like obviously they've had their fair share of sort of public issues with various bands that have been on that label, but it's amazing how it just kind of fell off at a certain point. Like they just didn't sign the next wave of bands. Yeah,
I mean, it's again. I mean, having not worked at SST and having not been an SST recording artist, it's hard for me to speak with authority on it. But my recollection is that there were a number of people in the organization that definitely had a lot to do with bringing certain bands into the fold. Mm-hmm. Not to the extent that they were considered like whatever, an A&R person or whatnot, but definitely people like Joe Carducci and Ray Farrell definitely had a role in bringing some of the bands in who were not necessarily what you would call like the original SST family bands, mm-hmm. Like Black Flag and all the various offshoots. And, they had huge commercial success with a number of bands that were not part of that initial ilk. Obviously Husker Du, Sonic Youth, Dinosaur Jr., Screaming Trees, That's just off the top of my head. But I mean, those bands all did incredibly well on SST. Soundgarden. And what happened next? Some of the people left the company. That's part of it. I think the other part of it was they seemed to have a release schedule and a roster that was by any measure unsustainable. I mean, they were just putting out an absolutely insane number of records, including a lot of records that people sort of thought were kind of subpar or didn't need to exist. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if that's entirely fair. I think everyone's got a right to put out what they like. And some of the records on SST that you might consider to be, not entirely important to the label's story. If Greg thought they were good, that's all that matters. I mean, the guy started the label putting out his own band's records at a point in time when perhaps nobody else wanted to. So who are we to say who are we to say that Zoog's Rift is not the most important SST artist of all time?
Well, I was going to say the world has caught up a little bit with My War Side too.
Yeah, exactly. So I don't know. I mean, some of the records that SST put out, towards what we'll call the end, that were sort of shit on. If those records came out today in a limited edition to 200 on Feeding Tube, people would be like, "Hey, this is fantastic! This is great." I mean, I think that's the problem, is that you build up this level of expectation of, oh wow, they've put out all these fantastic anthemic, radio-ready modern rock records. Who are these weirdos? What the hell is this? Yeah. I think it's great that they were still committed to. Still committed to doing the really original, challenging stuff, and you still see that today in certain labels. I mean, you look at Drag City today, and all the amazing stuff they put out, and I'm sure there's got to be some grumbly person in their 30s or 40s or 50s who's like, yeah, I remember the glory days of Drag City. Why can't they just keep putting out Bonnie Prince Billy and Pavement records over and over again? And sorry, those guys, they're still music fans, and they like more than 4 bands.
Yeah,
we get that with Matador. We get these people who are like, you guys peaked in 1996. How come you don't put out GBV records all the time? Whatever. That's not our problem.
Yeah, but and SST wasn't the only label. Like obviously Homestead, like a lot of labels weren't able to make that transition, and I think Sub Pop's had their fair share of well-publicized problems in that period immediately after Nirvana happened. But it's just it's almost like major labels just kind of came in and just took what they wanted to, and none of the labels were able to really kind of stay along for the ride for the next part of the story.
Yeah, that's mostly true. Although obviously Sub Pop and Matador, managed to hang for quite a while.
Well, Matador, I don't know, and this I'd be interested to hear your take, but almost like Matador kind of comes in right at the beginning of that huge wave, right? 90, 91, is that when everything felt like it started to change, or?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the whole period right after Nevermind and the sort of trickle down effect of that was something we didn't anticipate. That was something we didn't see coming for sure.
Yeah, how did that, I guess, Touch and Go, I guess, was another label that did transition too.
Yes.
And managed to take it, obviously they eventually closed down, but they took it a lot further. But why do you think there's so few labels that were able to kind of keep the bands? Was it just the bands unable to refuse these kind of major label offers when they were coming in, or unable to meet the demands of bands that were required at that time period, or?
It's hard to make a big generalization about it. I mean, the one thing that I used to frequently hear in that era when bands would get approached was, well, if we go to the major, we're going to have better distribution, and et cetera, et cetera. Well, it's like if everybody leaves the independent label they're on after one album, how is that independent label ever going to gain a foothold? How is a label supposed to build up the relationships and the distribution network, et cetera, if they lose their big bands after one album every time. I mean, that was kind of our argument to Teenage Fan Club, who ended up signing to Epic in the United States after one album on Matador. And I'm sorry, they signed to Geffen Records in the United States. But yeah, like how are we ever going to be a proper label if everybody just bolts after one record? Mm-hmm. And we were ridiculously fortunate that most of our bigger bands actually stayed with us through some super lean times and us learning how to do shit properly. And I mean, Pavement had no shortage of offers, both the early and kind of early period in the kind of middle period in their career. And they stayed with us the whole time. And it was because they were on our label that we were able to get things done as far as getting better distribution, hiring more people, signing more bands. I mean, I think they understood on some level that their value to us wasn't simply, we're putting out a new record on this label in October. I think they actually understood that they were part of the foundation of something that was hopefully going to help other bands. And that didn't always exist with every record company. I mean, it certainly existed with Touch and Go. It certainly existed with Drag City.
Mm-hmm. And I guess that's like that makes all the difference, right? Like when these bands are able to kind of like stick around and be there for the label when they're having their success too. I guess that keeps the label around.
Hopefully, yes. Hopefully.
Well, I guess there's also stories about like struggles when labels trying to adjust to the fact they've had a huge band, like a band that blew up on the roster, and they still, they can't cope with the growing pains, I guess, too.
Yeah, well, again, that's the other. I mean, that was a very common phenomena in the early '90s, and Albini wrote about it, and that he really did a great job of summing it up in that famous thing that he did for the Baffler and Maximum Rock and Roll. That Some of Your Friends Are Already Fucked piece that he wrote. That the very common phenomena is newish band makes a record for an independent label. They experience some measure of early acclaim, be it sales, be it college airplay, be it regional press, like vague buzz, whatever, or a combination of all the above, all that stuff. And very early on, people start kind of sidling up to them and saying, you could be doing so much better. These chumps who run your record label, they're amateurs, and they don't really have their shit together. And you guys are so good. It would be such a tragedy if you didn't grab the brass ring and do everything you possibly can to make a career out of this. And why aren't you daring yourself to be famous and all this kind of nonsense? I think Steve described it as someone just trying to appeal to your vanity, and which I think is a rather craven thing. And hopefully we don't engage in it more often than we already have. But yeah, I mean it's kind of a crummy situation. But instead of like having an open conversation about what small labels actually bring to the table, not purely as a B team or a feeder circuit, but how they actually make the world a better place, you instead kind of stick your nose in there and say, you know what, you guys could be doing so much better, even though I individually have never lifted a finger to make a record or sell a record. I'm going to get in your face and tell you how I can make you famous. It's kind of like that Jack Chick tract where Lucifer is telling the hapless metal band how huge they could be. I mean, there were dudes doing that all over New York and all over Hollywood, and some of them were entertainment lawyers. Some of them were actually ex-fanzine guys. Some of them were ex-college radio people. Some of them were ex-independent label people, but they were all over the place. And not a lot of bands came out of it with much to show for it. Some of them ended up making the worst records of their career, and ended up in debt for their troubles.
Well, before we get into this whole, I guess, post-Nirvana era too much, one person we got to discuss, who I don't think was ever in jeopardy of falling into this trap, was your former bandmate and rock and roll icon of sorts, GG Allin.
Yeah. I don't think the GG ever got chatted up by a major label person after a show, telling him he could be doing so much better. Yeah, that probably didn't happen.
I don't think so.
Somebody wearing a hazmat suit goes up to GG and is like, "So pleased to make your acquaintance."
The thing is, though, in 2016, do you think he would be approached? I think he would.
It's hard to say. I mean, certainly there would be a lot of notoriety attached to it.
There definitely.
I mean, can you imagine GG on social media?
Oh, his Instagram would be on fleek.
Yeah, that would be. Oh, that'd be great. That'd be amazing.
When I guess so when did you first meet Mr. Allin?
Well, keep in mind, I grew up in the Boston area,
yeah.
So I was very aware of GG because he was from New Hampshire, and certainly at some point in the
actually let's stop before we go any further. This now is turned out of GG Allin. So which is when did you first hear about GG Allin? I guess is the best way to put it.
He was sending out records to zines and stuff.
Okay.
So there were singles, and that first album on Orange that I got in the mail, and I think around the time those singles were coming out, he was pretty much banned from playing in Boston. I think the Jabbers played the Rat once, and I don't believe they were asked back. I think there was a subsequent incident, a somewhat famous incident at the time, where he sucker punched Martin Atkins at a what's the show? He sucker punched Martin Atkins at a Brian Brain show.
Oh my god!
And I think injured him pretty seriously. And I think after that he was banned from the Rat for life, and a number of other Boston clubs I think probably followed suit. So that was a bit of a career obstacle for the GG if you can't play any shows in the city closest to you. But yeah, I remember like Boston Rock wrote something about GG like bludgeoning Martin Atkins at this show, and he wrote an amazing letter like the following issue that was sort of like, like I did not punch Brian Brain in the face and cut his eye open, and so what if I did? So like the early era of cognitive dissonance with GG Allin. But yeah, I mean, those early records were certainly super funny, super catchy. But there was a period where kind of like the more kind of power poppy element of GG kind of began to degenerate and turn into something a lot less musical and a lot more kind of single-mindedly profane. And I think that was probably around the time that I really began to appreciate his thing, and like kind of decided that these records were either genius or they were reverse genius, or they were both. I mean, they were so horribly recorded. Like you would hear these like insane guitar solos kind of punched in out of nowhere. There's this guy who's like, he's trying to rhyme the word hand with hand. And it was like, I mean, it kind of became an obsession for me. Also knowing that he couldn't have been less hip at the time. I mean, people really like either despised him or just kind of revolted by him. This was certainly before he like kind of became adopted by everybody in the punk and hardcore community as sort of a iconic figure. I mean, he was really more an object of derision at this point in time.
Yeah, like who would he play with? Like what scene would he kind of fit in at this point?
There was really no scene. I mean, he really was like kind of like reduced. Like he was already like on the whole thing of like doing the Greyhound bus tours and playing with different pickup bands in every city. And you know, a lot of these shows were sort of like the early days of house shows, or like shows where like a club owner would be talked into booking GG and then like find out the day of the show what he was dealing with. Like, oh my God, he's only wearing a jockstrap. Oh my God, he's guzzling from a bottle of kaopectate. Oh no, oh no, why didn't someone tell me this was going to happen? I mean, keep in mind there was no Google then.
No,
if you were the poor motherfucker running the club, and you allowed someone to put the show on, and chances are you didn't have the ability to like research it ahead of time and find out that you were possibly in for a huge liability lawsuit. So yeah, I was definitely a fan, and you know, a couple of years after this initial contact with him, began corresponding a bit. Did an interview with him for the zine. Michael Board, who I was friends with back in those days, had an idea to. Well,
they did a split, right? Artless and GG Allin.
Yeah. But a few years after that, Michael Board talked Neil Cooper at Roar, Reach Out International, guys who did the Bad Brains tape and the Suicide tape and all this other amazing stuff. He talked Roar into giving him some money to record a live show in New York. So Michael essentially put together this, I'm being a little facetious here, sort of an all-star band to play behind GG. And it was Jay Mascis, myself, Mike Edison from Sharky's Machine, previously Killdozer, not the Wisconsin Killdozer. Steve Danziger from Pianosaurus, Kramer from Bongwater, and a number of other great bands. We put this band together. We rehearsed once with someone videotaping it. The show that we played at the Cat Club, I think, was promoted by Steve Blush of Seconds Magazine Infamy. And
I think you also mean American Hardcore Infamy.
Yeah, whatever. Whatever. Yeah. Fantastic writer, that guy. He's amazing.
I said infamy.
Yeah. Well, yeah, he's like, you know, he's that guy. That guy's to music what John Taffer is to the tavern business. Actually, no, that's not fair to John Taffer. So yeah, we played this show at the Cat Club, and the plug got pulled after like 3 songs because, you know, there was so much coming out of GG, so much coming out of him. You know that expression, he left it all on the stage? Do you know that expression?
Yes, I do.
Well, that expression has never been more appropriate because GG really did leave it all. Well, actually, no, he left it all on the stage except for what he chose to throw at the audience. So yeah, the plug got pulled, and yeah, that was a bad, ugly night. But yeah, some of that stuff ended up on the Roar Hated in the Nation compilation, which they compiled a lot of stuff from the records, but also used some of the rehearsal recordings and some of the stuff from that show. And it was after that GG and I began talking about making a record for Homestead, which, you know, one of the more ill-advised decisions of my life. I actually played on that record and have some songwriting credits on it. I need to stress I have nothing to do with the lyrical content. Nothing whatsoever to do with the lyrical content. But, you know, there were re-recordings of some older songs. Mike Edison co-wrote some of the songs in that record. And, yeah, that's the You Give Love a Bad Name record, which came out on Homestead.
Yep.
That was followed by, there was a 7-inch as well.
Very poorly named 7-inch.
Was that the Expose Yourself to Kids 7-inch?
Yes, that's the one.
Yeah, I think Chris Brokaw plays on that. I think Chris Brokaw and William Weber from Chrome Cranks are on that one.
Wow, that is another all-star band.
Yeah, another all-star band. And then there's a second Homestead record, the Freaks, Faggots, and Junkies album, which is a different band. I believe that's a New Hampshire band. Either a New Hampshire or a Boston-based band on that one.
So are you only a Holy Men? Like that's your only lineup of the GG?
I'm in that New York band, the
other one that he did,
the so-called Super Scum, and then there's a couple of shows I played that I think were probably billed as the Murderers, but there's another band, another like again New Hampshire-based lineup of the Murderers that I had no involvement with, and that band certainly lasted a lot more than 2 shows. So yeah, I mean, to use the baseball expression, I had a cup of coffee with GG Allin, or rather a cup of kaopectate, and yeah, it like they used to say about the Vietnam War, it seemed like a good idea at the time.
Someone's got to get Pete Frame to do a Rock Trees of GG Allin lineups.
Yeah, that would be great. Well, if you did a Pete Frame GG Allin family tree, I mean, you would see some amazing connections. I mean, you would have Wayne Kramer in there, you have Cheetah Chrome in there, you have Emily XYZ, you've got Chris Brokaw. I mean, through the David Peel connection, GG's only 1 degree of separation from John Lennon.
Yeah, that's true.
So I mean, I think that's pretty amazing that if you can actually say that GG's only a degree of separation away from the Beatles, that's pretty awesome.
Yeah,
I used to give my ex-wife grief about that because she's a huge Beatles fan and loves the Beatles, and she's a fantastic musician in her own right. And I took a lot of pride in being able to say to her, I'm only 2 degrees of separation away from the Beatles, which is such a terrible, unfair thing to say.
Well, it's true though.
I know it's true, but it's so completely unwarranted and like, I mean, talk about like undeserved. I mean,
hey, like if I take I think we got it down to 8 degrees of separation from Avril Lavigne in Earth Crisis. You can gladly take your 3 degrees from John Lennon.
Oh man, I forgot about that. That's great. That's amazing.
No, but that like it is also amazing when you think of it. Like even just Jay playing in it. Did Thurston Moore ever play in a lineup at GG Allin or no?
No. Thurston was invited to play in that that so-called New York Super Scum thing that Ford set up. He may have even had his name on the flyer for the show.
Okay, but
he either never agreed to do it or just couldn't make it. And I mean, Jay was a very last-minute replacement. Jay came in the day of the rehearsals and learned the songs in about 5 seconds. Not that they were difficult songs to learn.
No, but also Jay is a Noiseville recording artist, so his association. Oh no, was his Action Swinger 7-inch on Noiseville or no? Do you play on the second record?
I don't think he's on that one.
Oh,
I could be wrong.
It's Johan Kugelberg.
Yeah,
which I guess that is another.
Johan's on the first one.
Johan's on the first one, which is on Noiseville. The first one is.
Are you sure?
I'm 90% sure, and I only think this because I have all my Noiseville records in a box together, separated from my other records. Not because I dislike them, but because I collect records on. I think that to me is like, we were talking before about how there's very few things that bridge those two worlds of like New York hardcore and this other New York scene that we're kind of talking about. That label is like one of the only things that I can think of that does.
Yeah, you're right. You're right about that.
It is on Noiseville, the first 7-inch. Burn My Trip.
Okay, I stand corrected.
And I'm only saying this because I went to the resource, aka Discogs, to double check myself on this because I would never want to stand toe to toe against anyone in Rock and Roll Jeopardy, like more than you. Like you would be the person I would love to see just destroy me in that because you have more music knowledge than just about anyone I've ever met in my life.
Well, I have Google is what I have.
Well, that's what I'm also using too. So, but that's what I had to use to back up myself. But yeah. So I guess Jay plays on the second one, Fear of a Fucked Up Planet.
Yeah.
Which brings it back to me. But like I guess moving back to GG Allin and before we transition off that,
please.
Was there negative feedback to it at the time? Was it like something you had to deal with? Like PMRC
there was. I mean, keep in mind again, Homestead was so badly organized and so shitty at any kind of promo or marketing that for a lot of people in the kind of wider music community, they wouldn't have even known about the record. So
yeah,
the ability to sort of get blacklisted or be just shunned for association with GG, a lot of people simply just wouldn't have even known about it. But even within our own little corner of the indie rock universe, there definitely were people who weren't into it. I mean, there were people who disliked him and thought he was stupid, and obviously there were people who believed that the content was juvenile and misogynistic and just the wrong kind of shit for any number of reasons. There were a couple of people working at Dutch East at the time who kind of said, like, I don't think I can sell this. Like, not because stores don't want it, but just simply I have an issue getting on the phone asking someone to buy this record. I don't want to be associated with it.
Yeah.
So that was uncomfortable. And there were a couple of bands on the label. I mean, again, I don't want to name any names, but there certainly were people who kind of made it clear to me that they were not thrilled about being associated with this guy, his history, his whole thing. It was not something they found particularly cool.
Were there bands that you were like, because you did work with like controversial artists, were there bands and artists that approached Homestead or that you were even in talks with that at some point you were just like, I can't do this. This is too much even for me?
I can't think of anything like that. I think if there was anybody I didn't work with, it probably had more to do with just not being able to work with them rather than it being a content issue.
Yeah.
Funnily enough, the Frogs probably generated more actual controversy and bad will than GG did, which I think says a lot about how explosive that record was. Mm-hmm. And where people's heads were at. I mean, the Frogs, I definitely had more people say to me, I have a problem with you because of the Frogs than because of GG Allin. So,
yeah, I guess now it would be interesting to see which would have more of a Twitter backlash to it, GG or the Frogs, and I imagine probably GG.
Yeah, I'm not so sure. I think they would probably be running neck and neck for entirely different reasons.
Yeah, you're probably right on that one. I think GG though has some real dubious stuff in real life and outside of lyrical content too.
Well, yeah, that's a hard one to argue with. And again, you and I probably had the conversation before about the importance of separating the art from the artist, mm-hmm. and I think I'm of the opinion that. I think that's, as somebody who's trying to learn about art, that's a very interesting idea. But it's easier to do that if you're able to insulate yourself from the terrible things the artist has done to other people.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And yeah, again, I don't think much good is served me speaking ill of the dead, but GG is certainly somebody who did some pretty rotten things to people, and went served time in the pokey for it, and there was absolutely a point in time where I couldn't work with him anymore, and that's how it is.
Mm-hmm. Well, speaking of not being able to work with it anymore, there was a point where you couldn't do that with Homestead as well.
Yeah, probably about 5 years too late. But
what was the straw that broke the proverbial camel's back?
It's not a very exciting story. I mean, there was no like big blow up or dramatic thing. I mean, I had been there for 5.5 years. The working environment was pretty negative. The fellow who owned the parent company, I certainly owe him a debt of gratitude for letting a kid put out so many weird records. He was not big on positive reinforcement. He was not a particularly supportive guy, and musically, it was clearly not his thing. And he and his sort of inner circle seemed very suspicious of people who were music fans or people who really did care about the bands. And towards the very end of 1989, I learned third hand that one of my sole colleague at the label, Craig Marks, was applying for a job elsewhere. And I kind of knew at that moment that if he was going to leave, that the label's owner was probably not going to find the cash to hire a replacement, or really give me much say in who the replacement was. And I think at that point, I had reached the spot on the map where up until then I'd always believed that Homestead was probably doing more good than harm, and maybe like 51% to 49%. And I really felt like we were at the point where it was going to flip over to doing more harm than good. We were very close to doing bands much more harm than good. And I really couldn't hang around and watch it happen any longer. So he and I both went to Barry the same day and said, "Yeah, we're out of here. We're giving notice." And Barry didn't try to talk us out of it. He was just like, "Okay, thanks. Good luck. Good luck in your future things." And I gave 2 weeks notice, and I think like maybe the following day, he said to me, "Yeah, don't bother finishing out the 2 weeks. You're done. Thank you. You can get your shit out of your office now." So that was it. That was the end of me and Homestead.
That's a pretty incredible run you had, though. Like, obviously not the best ending, but that's like a 5-year run as like someone for their first time A&Ring at a label.
Yeah, I mean, I had a little bit of prior experience with some smaller shit I did on my own, but yeah, I mean, it was, look, I mean, there were a lot of good records, and unfortunately, as a business, it was very, very poorly run. It was a good learning experience, and I'm certainly proud of a lot of the music that came out. So, I mean, I feel there are things about it I do feel good about still.
Well, yeah, and I guess speaking of feeling good about it, how did you first become aware of all those New Zealand bands and some of the New Zealand stuff that would be put out by the label?
I'm trying to remember who the exact person was, but Patrick Amory, who
Yep.
he was a big early booster and proponent of a lot of the Flying Nun records. Some of the guys who he was colleagues with, WHRB in Cambridge, Jeff Weiss and Jim Barber, they were early Flying Nun adoptees. Venus Records, which is no longer with us, but Venus Records on 8th Street in New York, was bringing in a lot of the early Flying Nun stuff into New York City. And by early, I mean like 2 or 3 years after those records came out. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if I can remember who the exact person was, but I mean, certainly Patrick and Byron were two of the earliest people I knew who were singing and shouting the praises of things like the Verlaines and the Chills and the Clean and bands like that. But yeah, I mean, started kind of pen paling with Roger Shepard, started writing about those records, started playing those records on the radio, and it was a natural thing to like, hey, let's try to get these records out over here. Let's let's license them and put them out. So did the Clean and the Tall Dwarves and the Verlaines and the Chills. The Chills was an interesting one in that after initially doing the licensing deal with Flying Nun, they were signed outright to Homestead for one record. Always kind of with the knowledge that it wasn't going to be for more than one record because they did have bigger labels around the world chasing them. But I mean, that was a super exciting thing because there were so many great bands coming out at that point in time. And then it was like, Expressway Records and a lot of the noisier, stranger shit that either Flying Nun was only on the periphery of or wasn't really touching. Mm-hmm. It just sort of became very obvious that there was so much going on in New Zealand, even beyond Flying Nun. And that, and again, to this day, that's been a really great source of music.
Yeah, it's like, it's incredible, like, and I'm obviously, discovering this stuff way after the fact, but like how even I'm able to send this stuff to people and be like, check this out. And they're like, how have I never heard of any of this stuff? And it's like, yeah, from like the Dead Sea to even more abrasive stuff to like, Death and a Maiden, which is maybe one of the best pop songs like ever written. It's like, it's unbelievable. The Bats, like all the Bats stuff, and they're still good. Like these bands never got bad. It's crazy.
Yeah. And it's amazing. Yeah. It's completely incredible how many of them are still making really great music. And if they're not touring regularly, then they're performing infrequently. And it's very cool, and it's really great to see a lot of the stuff that Captured Tracks has done the last couple of years with getting some of those records out again, or putting out records by some of the bands that never had records in the U.S. in the first place. So I'm really happy that people are getting to hear that stuff.
Yeah, because Matador also did Matador do a Bats record? Or
no, we never did a Bats record. There's one of the David Kilgore records we did on Matador Europe. There's a Clean record we did on Matador Europe. There's a Tall Dwarves record we did on Matador Europe. There's a David Kilgore record that came out on 12XU reissued a couple years ago. So there still is kind of like a vague connection there. If you want to go back to the debacle of Matador attempting to manufacture and distribute Silk Breeze, certainly Matador had some small hand in a bunch of the Dead Sea records coming out domestically. Mm-hmm. Maybe not a good hand, maybe not an effective hand. But, there's still some connections there.
Okay, I guess before there's a couple more questions about Homestead. I promise it's not moving that painfully slow from my end.
Right.
Was there any bands you passed on?
On Homestead?
Yeah, that you wanted, that you like. I'm not like in general. I mean, but that you regret passing on, or that history has showed that you might have made a mistake on passing on a record. You can think of.
Well, I don't know, but when you say history, you mean like they went on to become huge and sell tons of records?
Yeah, like in that regard, like or even like they put a record later on that you were like, oh, that was like an artistically more, like certainly, if you were a fan of Deep Wound and passed on Deep Wound and then heard what Dinosaur Jr. did, I imagine you'd be like, oh well, I have regrets in that regard. But like or like Martin passing on Nirvana too, for Beggars.
Yeah, I don't actually remember anything like that. I mean, I'm sure there were bands that we passed on that went on to sell tons of records for somebody. I mean, that had to have happened. However, as far as anybody who I actually liked, who I think we should have worked with, I mean, the one thing I'll say about Homestead is there were too many records. I mean, we put out way too many records. So it's really more a matter of which records I should have passed on just for the sake of common sense. But yeah, I can't really think of anything that. I mean, there were bands that I was a fan of that I would have liked to have worked with, but they simply.
Well, maybe that's the question I'm going for, because like you kind of did work with every band. Like that's like when you go through the discography, it's like, who were the artists, like from like Nick Cave to, the Membranes to GG Allin. You kind of ran the gamut.
Yeah, I think I don't know if you remember the point in time when Alex Chilton kind of made his comeback and started making records again, but there was sort of a inept attempt to try to sign Alex Chilton. He was not particularly interested, and that was very wise on his part. So, I mean, that would be an example of a band that Homestead, an artist that Homestead tried to work with that wasn't interested in working with us. There was probably multiple attempts at doing something with the Three Johns. That didn't happen. And again, very smart on their part. But other than that, I can't really think of anybody. I mean, there were bands I was fans of that recorded for other labels that would have had no need to be on them. So yeah, I don't want this to be like this arrogant thing of like, I got to work with every band I liked. I mean, obviously that's not the case, but there were bands that had their own relationships with very good labels that would have had no need to be on Homestead.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I hear that. Okay, well, I guess the last question was, you left in '89. Did Nirvana ever approach you guys, or was that kind of after that they were looking for labels?
I don't think Nirvana ever approached Homestead, but keep in mind, we got so much shit in the mail.
Yeah.
I mean, I can't promise you that a Nirvana cassette wasn't thrown away, but I don't think that happened. I mean, the sort of mass dumping of demos really began in earnest in the Matador years, probably because we were getting so many and the level of arrogance was so sky high. I'm sure there's somebody who sold 1 million records whose cassette tape was thrown out the window of 611 Broadway at one time or another. I mean, yeah, if Nirvana approached Homestead, I'm not aware of it. So,
did you ever meet Kurt Cobain?
I met him once. It's a somewhat embarrassing story. I was in Los Angeles. Pavement were playing at the Whiskey in L.A. And after the show, an individual who worked very closely with both Kurt and Courtney tried to introduce me to the two of them. And he said hello and shook my hand very quickly and then immediately disappeared. And I proceeded to get my ear chewed off by Courtney for the next 5 or 10 minutes, which is not a unique experience. A lot of people have had their ear chewed off by her. But yeah, that was our only actual like face-to-face meeting. So he seemed very nice.
Yeah, because you know about the graffiti and everything, right?
Yeah, I do, and I mean there is a story behind the graffiti. I don't know if you know the story.
Well, no, I didn't. Well, I don't know. I thought the story was that he was just a huge fan of Homestead.
I'm not aware of that. That's not what the graffiti is about.
Oh, what's the graffiti about then? Is something else?
All right. Well, just to backtrack, there is in circulation these kind of ridiculous photos of Courtney in her and Kurt's West Hollywood apartment at the time. Some pictures of Courtney kind of splayed out on her bed, and there's a heavily graffitied wall behind her, and my name is on the wall with the A in Gerard is circled. Sort of, anarchy style.
Yeah.
And that's on the wall. And then there's some other pictures that have been floating around for years of Kurt in the same bedroom with that same thing up in the background. So the backstory to this is Hole had been signed by Geffen Records, and Newsweek magazine was doing an article on the phenomena of bidding war bands. Mm-hmm. Now, today people would be like, what the hell does that mean, bidding war band? Well, in the early 90s, it was like the weird period where major labels were falling over themselves to sign Helmet or Hull or Veruca Salt or whoever to these outlandish, preposterous contracts because every other major label was chasing them, so we have to as well. this sort of pie in the sky thing is going on. And Newsweek was going to do kind of like a fluffy, humorous piece about it, and they wanted to illustrate the article, so they wanted Courtney for the photo. And I think it was pitched to Courtney as though they were doing a piece on Hole, like not a piece on the phenomena of bands getting too much money, but rather like a piece on her. So she decided that the right way to illustrate this story would be sort of like as a way of like getting revenge on her various detractors. So they spray painted the bedroom with the names of all these people who she's had some kind of beef with, real or imagined. So it's like there's like K Records, Nation of Ulysses, and me.
So I assume Hole was one of those rare demos that did make it into the dumpster at Homestead.
I don't think we ever got a Hole demo, but I absolutely did my share of making fun of Courtney in various places, in print and otherwise, and she did not take kindly to it. I mean, I think at some point she probably was like, "Oh, it's all a big gag. Who cares?" Or the sort of like, "Well, we're all in the fraternity of record business scum now, so let's just let it slide." I mean, we have mutual friends, so I don't really have anything. I don't have anything serious against her, but they do this photo session for Newsweek, and then the article comes out, and they've cropped the photo, and you can't see any of the graffiti.
Oh, really? Because that photo is, though, now very widely circulated. Like,
yeah. So the fellow the photographer who did the session took some Polaroids in the session.
Oh.
And he sent me one of the Polaroids. I used to have that up on my fridge. I don't know where the other pictures came from, but yeah, those pictures are around. I think there's like a Nirvana coffee table book that one of those pictures is in.
There's the box set too.
And there's one or two scenes in that Kurt doc that was on HBO that take place in that room, and so yeah, for a couple of decades now, like 2 or 3 times a year, someone will be like, "Hey, have you seen this picture before? What's the deal with this?" Or someone will be like, "Oh, you must have been really good friends with Kurt Cobain." And I'm like, "Nope, sorry, not. That's not what happened." And I sort of thought that was over with, and then the documentary came out, and I had tons of people asking me about it. So it's a little embarrassing, but it's kind of funny. Funny.
Did they ever? They never. Because I guess they were on Sub Pop, right? Oh, they were on Geffen, right? So they never had dealings with Matador.
There is one dealing with There's 2 dealings with Matador I can talk about, since this has now devolved into me shit talking about people who are dead and can't defend themselves.
Well, we did just GG Allin. I think it's.
No, this is what I always wanted to do. I always wanted to be able to like look back on everything I've ever tried to do helping people, but then just reduce it to shit talking about dead people. That's super dignified. Thank you, Damien. You're really making me look good here.
Hey, this is the podcast where we talk about punk's past, and unfortunately, it's not always pretty.
Some parasite who's never achieved anything is just gonna shit talk about dead people who made great records for the next 2 hours. Stay tuned, everybody. Okay, so there's 2 Nirvana Matador things I can tell you about. One is you remember the period in which they made In Utero, and there was all that nonsense going on about how allegedly the record company wanted Scott Litt to remix the album. Mm-hmm. The band was against it, and then Albini went public with his comments. Do you remember any of that stuff?
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah. That was just the time I was becoming very cognizant of the larger world of music journalism.
Okay. So there is an individual who had previously managed Nirvana and was still very close to them, who reached out to us, and apparently the sort of compromise solution that had been arranged was Scott Litt was going to remix In Utero. That was going to be the version of the record that was going to be the real release. However, to sort of deal with the idea of, well, there's an authentic version of In Utero, and if you have a problem with the Scott Litt version, you can buy this limited edition real version of it, the Albini as is version. We were asked, would Matador put out the Scott Litt free version of In Utero on vinyl?
Oh, that never came out, right?
Actually, I think it did eventually come out as something like Record Store Day special, maybe like a year ago it came out.
Yeah, but I mean, because I think but the vinyl version of it that did come out is not a great pressing, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, I haven't heard it, so I can't comment.
Okay,
but so we were asked.
I have it, and I can comment that it doesn't sound
okay.
right.
Okay, so we were asked, would Matador be willing to do like a limited pressing version of the Scott Litt free version of In Utero? And my response, which will probably go down in history as one of the dumbest things anyone's ever said, was, "Can we hear it first?" Because, I mean, look, I got to be honest, I was not a particularly big Nirvana fan.
Yeah.
I mean, I have to say, I did actually really like In Utero a lot when I heard it, but I was not one of the people who loved Nevermind. I didn't like Bleach. I had a lot of respect for those guys as people, but I was not one of these people who was a huge fan of the band. I legitimately felt like there were much, much better bands all over the world. And I'm not saying that to defame anybody or make people feel bad whose lives were changed by Nirvana. I mean, that's great for them. But I was not one of those people. I was not one of those people who was like, oh my God, my world just got turned upside down. That didn't happen for me. So
it always kind of feels that way, though, right? Like it's always like you're like that band when you're around for something before it happens. It's always like, oh, that's the band people have chosen to take up from this genre. It never feels like it's the band that it should be, unless you experience it from the other side of it, which is this is the band that brings you into the genre.
I think at that point I was probably a little too old to have a band of the moment thing happen. I'd already been listening to music for too long and probably too wary of all the shit that was going on with music and media at that point to like share in this sort of We Are the World moment of wow, punk just went number one. I personally couldn't relate to it, but that shouldn't take away from the joy and the moment of discovery it brought to other people's lives. It wasn't for me, and it wasn't supposed to be for me. But getting back to this story, I was like, yeah, well, can we hear it first? Because I mean, as somebody who had like already kind of gone on the record as saying, I think Nirvana are like kind of a little overrated. It seemed a little hypocritical that Matador would then turn around and put out a Nirvana record.
Yeah.
Anyway, the response we got to that was not particularly favorable. It was kind of like, this is, borderline insulting that you want to hear the record first. Like this is the biggest and best band in the world, and what's your fucking problem? And it's like, yeah, maybe we're not the right label to. Maybe it should be somebody else. But the other story, which is not so much a Kurt story, but maybe it's more of a Mark Smith story. Around the time that Matador was working with the Fall were asked to support Nirvana on an 8 or 9 city run of North America. Oh. And these were playing rather large places. We're talking like 5,000 to 7,000 capacity. The shows were either going to sell out instantly or sell out very quickly. And I believe the guarantee that was being offered per show was in the neighborhood of $1,500. which is not a huge sum, not a huge sum of money, but for opening bands of that era, it was. That was still the pay to play era. Nirvana, to their credit, I don't think ever asked someone to do a pay to play thing. But I mean, yeah, they could have pretty much gotten anybody they wanted for $300 a night. 1,500 was on the high side for what a band would get for a show like that. We forwarded the offer to Mark Smith, who immediately turned it down. And we went back to Mark and said, look, the label will help out with this a little bit. You should really reconsider. These are probably going to be the biggest shows you're ever going to play in the U.S. It might be an interesting experiment, et cetera, et cetera. And Mark's reply was, "I want $10,000, like per show." And yeah, that was. I think Half Japanese ended up getting those shows.
Wow. Well, it's funny because every single band that had that slot for Nirvana is kind of elevated this weird cult status. Like every single band that opened for them after they kind of became popular, it feels like.
Yes. Well, keep in mind the Fall did actually have their own cult status.
Oh, absolutely. Already. They're kind of a popular band. They're kind of significant. Yeah. I remember one time we met Marky Smith. We played a festival with the Fall in England called Jackalope, and he got introduced to me, and he's like, "Oh, fucked up from Canada," and then started singing a song and walked away. And I was pretty stoked that he knew that I was in a band called Fucked Up, and then, didn't talk to me for the rest of the night and switched slots with us and ruined the rest of the festival for us. But that's a digression that we don't need to get into.
Yeah. We know something. It's really bad to speak ill of the dead.
Yeah.
Just because you encourage me to do that doesn't mean that you should do it.
No, that's true. That is true. But I think, is he dead?
No, of course not.
Okay, I'm gonna be like you. I was gonna be like, did I miss something in the last 48 hours that I should have maybe not been saying about? So
I'm just looking forward. I'm just looking forward to this being a big scoop on social media.
Yeah, definitely. I guess oh man, there's so many places I want to go, so many more questions I want to talk to you about, but I'm not going to force you to answer any more questions. But Gerard, before you go, I have to say that Scott Thompson was on the show from Kids in the Hall.
Oh, fantastic. I love Scott.
Yeah, absolutely. And I brought up the fact that I was like, yeah, you guys did that amazing, there's that incredible soundtrack that, we have this connection through because Matador Records. And he was like, oh, yeah, Matador. And I'm like, so how did you pick the Shampoo song for that record? And because I remember you telling me.
There isn't actually a Shampoo song on the record.
Yeah, there is.
There is?
Yeah. Yeah.
Now I have to discog this.
I remember the story being that I think the story was that you guys told me that it was a very expensive song to acquire.
No, there is no Shampoo song on the record. There's actually a Tragically Hip song on the record.
Oh, I knew that. Tragically
Which that was that's Jake barking because he doesn't like the Tragically Hip either. That was very much the band's. That was very much Kids in the Hall's insistence on including the Tragically Hip because they're so huge in Canada. They referred to them as the Hip.
Okay. The Hip.
That's
what they are, the Hip in Canada.
Yeah, they are the Hip. So,
at risk of starting a cross-border war, we'll transition off the Hip conversation immediately.
No, we had a conversation when they were filming Brain Candy. I went to the set and I had a conversation with those guys about their ideas for the soundtrack, and everyone's throwing names around of their various favorite bands, and Scott says, what about something for the blank? He didn't say blank. He said something other than blank. And I'm like, well, like what? And he says Shampoo.
Because I did ask him about Shampoo.
Yeah.
And he's like, oh, I have no idea. It's probably just some band Bellini told me to mention.
Oh no, he suggested shampoo, but we didn't actually put shampoo on the record.
Okay, I'm sorry. I thought maybe it was inquired about, and that's why it was kind of expensive.
Which would be good. But no, the funny thing is, about a year and a half after the movie opened and crashed and burned, and the soundtrack went on to become one of the biggest money losers in Matador history. I was eating at this place in this restaurant in West Hollywood called Barney's Beanery, a burger place, which is kind of fallen on hard times. But I was eating at one of the tables all the way in the back of the restaurant once, and Kevin McDonald and Scott Thompson were eating at the table in front of me. And I was trying very hard not to eavesdrop on their conversation, because you shouldn't do that when you're famous people are trying to dine out in peace. The problem is when you in that era, if you went to that place, you were constantly eating dinner or lunch with somebody you were a fan of, like sitting next to you. So it was always a little weird. But given the connection of the record and this funny history, I did after dinner interrupt their conversation, and I went over and I said, "Hey, I'm really sorry to bother you guys, but I'm blah, blah, blah from blah, blah, blah records. And you guys might remember we had those conversations about Brain Candy a couple of years ago." And they couldn't have been nicer. They were like, "Oh, cool. Great to see you," et cetera, et cetera. And Scott looked at me, and almost with tears in his eyes, he said, "Man, I hope you guys didn't lose too much money on that."
You got to hear the podcast with him. It is truly an incredible listen. Like, his punk stuff is also really awesome and deep. So
I need to hear that. He's incredible. I'm a huge fan of his.
Absolutely. Well, also, I guess I lied. One more thing before you go. What's one GG show story?
Oh God! Oh my God! I shouldn't tell you.
Dead, but
all right.
He put it out there. He wants this out there. This is part of the legacy, right? He had the open casket funeral.
Okay.
This is so Merle doesn't have to sell any more dreadlocks. He can just, just rely on GG sales.
Okay, I'm looking up someone's name now on the. I'm trying to look up this guy's name. I may not be able to find the name of the person involved. Okay, so I think this is probably 87 or so, and GG is playing a show. The GG band are playing a show at the Lismar Lounge in New York. Mm-hmm. Maybe I think it might even be another Steve Blush production, and because no other club in the right mind will put this on. And,
this guy knows music.
So the day of maybe 2 days before the show, our bass player Mike Kirkland, formerly of Prong, announces that he can't play the gig because he has to attend a wedding, which seems a little suspicious because the show's on a Monday night. So anyway, we very quickly scramble, and George Sully of the Raunch Hands agrees to fill in, learns the songs very quickly. I think Chris Lombardi got drafted in, the second guitarist, very quickly. Mike Edison again on drums, me on guitar. So the night of the show rolls around. Sorry, the day of the show rolls around, and I get a phone call at Homestead. It's from some guy who's an independent film director. He's recently done like a remake of I Was a Teenage Werewolf that I think the Fleshtones guest starred in. And he's working on a new kind of like comedy horror schlock film, and he wants to base it around like a New York touring band. Like he wants it to be like a young New York punk band. He wants them to be in the movie, and they're like being pursued by a slasher or something like that. And I guess he called Louise at CB's looking for ideas, and she didn't want to talk to him, so she was like, "Call Gerard. He'll know somebody." And I kind of want to get off the phone, but this guy is like really, really hammering me to try to find a band. So this is kind of a shitty thing for me to do, but I said, "Hey, look, there's some New York band playing the Lismar Lounge tonight. You should go check that out. They're really punk. They're very punk. You'll be into it." So
I get to the venue, and I suddenly realized, to my shock and horror, that they serve drinks in glasses, like real glasses, pint glasses and shit. And I try to explain to the club, look, someone's going to get hurt. We really need plastic cups. And they're like, we're not paying for plastic cups. So I went upstairs to the bodega next to the club and bought like 200 plastic cups because I didn't want to lose an eye at this show. And while I'm standing in line to pay for the plastic cups, I turn around and there's Mike Kirkland buying a beer standing right behind me. And he's like, are you having a party? And I'm like, no, I'm not having a party. Aren't you late for a wedding? And he's like, oh, yeah, that's right. I got to go pick up my suit. See you later. So that's what a smart person does when they're invited to play with GG Allin. They suddenly remember they have a wedding to go to. So anyway, the show happens. The good news is it actually finishes. We actually play like 9 or 10 songs, which is kind of incredible. But during the very first song of the set, GG kind of climbs up on one of the stage monitors, grabs onto the lighting rig above the stage where all the flash pots are.
Yeah.
He pulls the thing down. Like he pulls it down. And I can't see it land on somebody, but clearly it's landed on somebody. And about like in between the second and the third song of the set, and I'm trying to tune my guitar, which isn't easy because it's dark and there's probably GG's blood or shit covering the tuner, so it's hard to see. Someone taps me on the shoulder. And it's that guy. It's the film director guy. And like he's holding like a tourniquet to the side of his head. he's bleeding profusely, and he's like, he's very upset. He's very upset, and he says, "Which one of you guys is Gerard?" And I look around and I point at Chris Lombardi and I say, "That's him over there."
What at Gigi? You'd be like, yeah, that's Gerard over there.
So anyway, we finished the set and I'm trying to get the hell out of there as fast as I can. And Gigi is on the sidewalk talking to this guy, and this guy is like, he's saying to Gigi like, maybe if you like give me some money right now, we won't have to involve our insurance companies or the police. And Gigi is, of course, like, covered in blood, just wearing a jockstrap. And Gigi says to him, "Do I look like I have $300?" and just walks away. So,
oh, that's awesome, buddy.
Yeah, I have a better story, but
well, go if you want to tell more.
I can't tell it. I can't tell it.
Okay.
It involves. I'll tell you the next time I see you somewhere, I'll tell you the story. It's just not for
when the person's dead, we can tell it on the air.
Podcast, but it involves a young woman's dogged attempts at getting Gigi to record a cover of "Paradise" by the Dashboard Light.
Oh,
and the story takes a very unfortunate turn.
Oh my God! Okay, well
I can't tell that one on a podcast.
No, let's leave that for off air. Gerard, I didn't even get to talk to you about how Matador started. I didn't get to talk to you about how you met.